Have you ever sat down to brainstorm a new idea and felt like your imagination just dried up? Well, what if you had a formula to unlock your wildest and most creative imagination, unleashing an unlimited flow of your best ideas? Well, lucky for you, I found the formula, and when I put it to the test, it completely transformed my artwork as an artist. Today, we're going to be deep diving into this book, The Imagination Muscle by Albert Reed, so that by the end of this video, you will have the formula to unlock your highest imagination. If you've ever tried to create something, you may not have realized that before you can create, you must first imagine. And when you think about imagination, you may not have a concrete definition in your mind of what imagination is, but the author Albert Reed describes imagination as a moment in which he experiences a quickening of thought, a sudden inner expansion. And he narrowed down the settings in which he experiences the most imagination to things like leaving a party and stepping out onto a cold, dark street, going for a solitary walk at dusk, or being in the shower. He calls them the spaces in between your brain operating on a fully conscious level and a fully unconscious level. Like the times that you're just barely conscious enough to drive your car from point A to point B, but then you can't remember how you actually got there. And with all of our modern technological advances, it seems like our imaginations are actually being hindered. We no longer have a quiet drive home from work, we turn on the radio. We no longer have to read the shampoo bottle on the toilet because we just look at TikToks. But Reed points out the irony in all of this, the irony in the fact that our society has become so increasingly advanced technologically, that imagination has become so sparse and hard to find, makes it even more valuable because imagination may be the only thing that is untouchable to technology and AI. It is the only thing that is emphatically ours as humans. So let's talk about how we imagine. Now, believe it or not, the history of imagination isn't what you think it might be, and imagination wasn't even a term. It wasn't even recognized as a thing until recent human history. And many of the early origin stories and myths in our culture discouraged imagining. It discouraged going against the natural order. It discouraged exploration. Think about stories like Frankenstein, the Greek myth of Prometheus, or even, dare I say, Adam and Eve. Okay, just think about the stories that we've told over the years. Imagination was a cause of suspicion, and in 1265, St. Thomas Aquinas wrote, "Demons are known to work on a man's imagination until everything is other than what it is." It wasn't until the 18th century that imagination was really discovered, and it began to revolutionize and change philosophy, art, writing, ethics, even religion. And as an artist, this might be a little hard to believe. How could there have been no creativity or imagination or originality in art up until the 18th century? Well, if you look at artists like Michelangelo, many of the greatest artists leading up until that point, they had the knowledge of color and shadow and subject. How come none of them ever discovered or unlocked expressionism? And this brings us to one of my favorite parts of the book, which is the 3 levels of imagination theorized by Joanne Nicholas Tettens. Level 1, first order imagining. He calls this the realm of the senses. This is a base level of imagination that could also be considered our ability to just perceive. It's the ability of our mind to conjure up a picture of a horse because we've seen a horse. It's the ability to think of a hammer because we've seen a hammer. The second level of imagination, there are joints. Often, you can see the visible joints between existing ideas. It's the ability of your brain to come up with the image of a Pegasus in your mind, something that doesn't exist, but because you've seen wings and you've seen a horse, you can combine them into a new idea in your head. And he says that for most of us, this is where our imagination is active. This is where we live. Most people never leave level 2. And as a painter, it really got me thinking, have I even ever left level 2? Now this leads us to third order imagining, only accessible to the imaginative mountaineers. It's only accessed by scientists, artists, and inventors, and Reed says possibly really only artists. In this level of imagination, there are no joints because we are not connecting already existing ideas. We are creating something completely new, something that is more than the sum of its parts and is unrecognizable from the parts that create it. And as a painter, I just really started thinking, how do I enter level 3. Now, English poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge even went on a few centuries later to expand on Tetton's 3 levels of imagination. And he said that level 3 is a combination of heart and intellect. And he even demoted the greatest scientists to simply being in level 2 because they lacked the ability to imagine. Scientists claim that imagination is simply just a highly evolved survival mechanism, and they assume that since we are a lot like other animals, we must just be completely like other animals, just more evolved. But despite all modern research and technological advancement, no scientist has ever been able to create a formula for the human imagination. Even artificial intelligence is unable to capture the essence of humanity. In essence, we have not yet been able to outsource the imaginative flame because it cannot be reproduced. Let's talk awakenings. Now, we know that the awakenings of the very first evidence of creativity in human beings dates back thousands of years, but what you might not know is that imagination in humans is very different than every other advancement we've made, in that there was no buildup. There was nothing. There was no art, and suddenly cave art was everywhere, dating back 35,000 years. And it seemed that all of the cave art had a uniformity of what was painted and how. It marks the human ability to see something beyond what is there. And logically, it also marked the ability to hold an image in our minds, because these cave paintings deep in caves of bison meant that the viewer had to go out, see a bison, remember what the bison looked like, go into the cave and paint it. I'm pretty sure they didn't carry a bison in with them. Now that brings us to why you're here, which is the 8 steps to unlocking your highest imagination. And this is simply the 8 steps that I found and broke this book into, but I highly recommend reading it because you may get something different out of it than I did. So let's get into step number 1. Observe more. Now, when you think of observation, the last thing you probably think about is sea navigation, but observation is exactly how the first Phoenician sailors, as early as 1000 BC, were able to navigate the seas using only the stars. You see, observation bears the torch for imagination. It was by observing the spiral descent of a maple tree leaf that Leonardo da Vinci actually wrote up the first diagram and plan for a helicopter. And by the mid-17th century, everybody was observing. In fact, people began selling tools to help you observe better, like the magnifying glass or a telescope. But Reid talks about something called observational closure. He talks about the innate human desire to reflect on and ponder what you've just seen or observed. So my question to you is, when is the last time that you spent 30 minutes observing people? When have you sat in a coffee shop and watched the people around you? When's the last time that you hiked and just watched how the leaves blew in the wind? When's the last time that you sat on your lunch break and looked at people out the window? My whole point is, simply sitting and observing for 30 minutes stimulated so many ideas in my mind that I would have missed out on if I picked up my phone. So, observe more. That leads us to step number 2. Be a beginner again. Now, habits make up more than 50% of our activity. Psychologist William James wrote about this as early as 1890. He declared, "All of our life, if it has a definite form, is but a mass of habits." Reid argues that habit can creep into the imaginative domain. It works as a sedative, stifling our ability to question things and suffocating our imagination. Now, obviously, habits can either be productive or counterproductive, but in the world of imagination, habits can actually stunt our growth. So how do you keep your mind open and susceptible to new and changing information and ideas? How do you stop getting stuck in the grain of habit? Reid looks at some of the most remarkable mathematicians and scientists and discovers that most or a lot of them had imaginative hobbies like painting, playing an instrument, creating music, writing poetry. Isaac Newton was a painter and a poet. Albert Einstein played violin. And Nobel Prize winner Alexander Fleming, who discovered penicillin, was a painter. There is a Zen Buddhist saying that is, there are many possibilities, but in the mind of the expert, there are few. Being a beginner again can give you a fresh perspective to see things that you've never seen before. So as an artist, I started trying new mediums. I started drawing things that I don't normally draw and painting things I don't normally paint. Step 3, take imaginative risk daily. So the chances are, if you're watching this video or you're reading this book, You might be more afraid of your imagination than you might realize. And as an artist, I completely relate because it's scary to try changing it up. And so Reid challenges us to, instead of thinking of failure as failure, start thinking of it as imaginative risk. It's the risk you take to imagine. And in fact, the American inventor Thomas Edison made imaginative risk his way of life. He changed the world with his contributions to electric power, electric light, the phonograph, the motion picture camera, and you probably know him best for his light bulb. But from a different angle, if you were to look at his entire runway, you would see that there were far more failures than successes. In fact, Thomas Edison set himself and his team a quota. They had to come up with a certain amount of ideas every week, every month. Even if they were bad, didn't matter. But he often exceeded his own quotas and was known to actually, in one day, write down 112 ideas. And he is quoted as saying, "I have not failed, I have simply found 10,000 ways that won't work." So I started coming here every day and drawing something. As soon as I get here, I would open a notebook and I would just draw something. Even if it was good, even if it was bad, I would do a fast 5-minute drawing and I would hang it on the wall. Whatever your art form is, create every day. Create small things, create things that are bad, create new things. So set yourself a daily quota. 1 drawing a day, 1 paragraph of writing a day, 10 minutes of playing my instrument a day. That brings us to step 4, keep a commonplace book. Now, one of the things that some of the most imaginative, creative minds in human history have in common is that they all kept something that Reid calls a commonplace book. And we see an example from a page of Leonardo da Vinci's commonplace book. And as you can see, it is a mixture, a chaotic scramble of writings and notes and drawings and diagrams and observations all pooled into one place. And fun fact, if you didn't know, Leonardo da Vinci wrote from right to left so that you would have to put his pages in front of a mirror to read them. It's a gentle chaos of a less structured form of note-taking. And looking back through these books, you can often follow the journey of one's thoughts. All right, step 5, find the waking moment. A celebrated mathematician from the classical world, Archimedes, often came up with his best ideas while he was relaxing in a bathhouse. And it was while he was sitting in the warm water, half engaged, half daydreaming, that often his best ideas would come upon him. And with most of the most well-known scientists, innovators, artists, they have one thing in common, which is the ability to hold a half-formed idea in their mind for a long time. And the eureka moment often doesn't come in one singular moment of work, but when you least expect it, when the idea has become softened by a pondering and a turning over in the mind for a long period of time. And specifically, when you allow an idea to sit in your mind as you pass through stages of consciousness and unconsciousness is often when you will have your eureka moment. And it's in this in-between, between awake and asleep, that many of the best creatives have found their best ideas. In fact, it's a zone that most geniuses have spent decades trying to find other artificial ways to access. Some of the methods were crazy and gross, like Friedrich von Stiller, don't know if I'm saying that right. He would keep a drawer of rotten apples in his house, and when he needed to feel imaginative, he would open the drawer and smell them. And decomposing apples emit ethylene, which I guess can help you hallucinate, I don't know. Or Ivan Turgenev, who would put his feet in hot water to stimulate ideas. Or Paul Erdos, who would take amphetamines because they made him feel creative. But before you go try an external stimulant to try to enter this creative state, Reid points out something called the waking moment that you can take advantage of every single day. Sometimes when we wake in a jolt to our alarms, but other times, on a weekend maybe, when we aren't awakened suddenly and quickly, we can sometimes slowly awaken and enter sort of through a transition state that he calls the waking moment. It's a subtle transition as you're crossing the threshold from being asleep to being awake. Walter Scott even wrote to a friend that the half hour between waking and getting up are when his best ideas happened. It's in this morning lucidity, this looseness of the mind, that our imaginations are the most active. So, when you first wake up in the morning, keep your commonplace book or a sketchbook by your bed, or when you're about to fall asleep at night and you're finding yourself drifting off but not quite asleep yet. When you have those sudden expansions of something you haven't thought of before, try to wake yourself enough to write it down or draw it. Or for me here, what I did is I actually took a nap on my little beanbag sofa back there. And I took a nap in my art studio on purpose so that right when I woke up, in my grogginess, in my looseness of mind, I could start creating, start adding to my paintings. Step 6, innovate, don't invent. When he invented the printing press in 1450, Johannes Gutenberg had found a new way of seeing things, but was his creation an invention or an innovation? Let's talk about it. Because many people before him had come up with ways to mass print letters onto paper. By the 8th century, the Japanese, Chinese, and Korean were already printing using wooden carved blocks which had their letters on it and printing onto paper. What's the difference? So what's so special about Gutenberg's printing press, and why is he known as its creator when he's actually not the first one to print? Well, Gutenberg was the first one to combine ideas into something that had never been combined before. He grew up watching his dad stamp gold and silver coins at work. He observed the structures of wine and olive presses, and being in a society with an interchangeable alphabet, he became the first to create a massive scale printing press. And Gutenberg isn't the only person that has famously been credited for the inventions of his predecessors. Did you know that Romeo and Juliet was not written by William Shakespeare? It had actually been written and rewritten by many authors before him, if Shakespeare was even a real person, but let's not get into that. But the problem was, the original Romeo and Juliet was just like a skeleton of the story that we know today. Shakespeare is the one who unified the story, added the drama, shortened the timeline, and got us invested in the story. Rather than Romeo visiting Juliet's balcony every day for 9 months, as in the original versions, Shakespeare condensed the entire story to 4 days. They pledged to marry immediately, and the tragedy began to unfold immediately. Sometimes the best ideas are the combination and reformation of already existing ideas that nobody has ever thought to combine before. Even Pablo Picasso's most famous work has been traced back to influence from other artists, like El Greco and Paul Cézanne. And this reminds me of a little book that I read a long time ago called Steal Like an Artist, which essentially gets back to the point that there are so few original ideas anymore, and that in fact most original ideas aren't original at all because subconsciously they are some form of reassembly of what you've seen in your lifetime. That brings us to step 7, talk to strangers. So up until the middle of the 17th century, coffee was unknown to Europe. That is until Pasquale Rosé arrived from modern-day Turkey and introduced espresso and coffee to Europe. He opened one of the very first coffee carts. And it was advertised as, "It quickens the spirit and makes the heart light. It makes one fit for business." And it was such an immediate success that crowds began to form, and people nearby started opening up their houses so that people could come in and sit, and the first cafes were born. But we called them coffee houses. So, enter the first coffee houses. By 1663, 82 coffee houses had opened in that same town, and something amazing happened. Suddenly, imagination and information wasn't limited only to being exchanged at churches and universities. People were meeting and talking in these coffee houses. It was a civilized place for the average person and people who would not normally intermingle to meet and discuss. In fact, famous frequenters of coffee houses include Isaac Newton and Benjamin Franklin. They found the environment to be nurturing and stimulating to the mind. And in fact, these coffee houses were such a source of information and gossip that Charles II actually tried to suppress them. And Charles II wasn't the only one that didn't like the coffee houses. Women weren't allowed in coffee houses, and women actually protested coffee houses, saying that they were emasculating their husbands, that they sat around and gossiped all day, which wasn't manly. But soon the coffee house became the place for buyers and sellers to meet each other, and thus the broker was formed. And Reed describes a coffee house as something he calls a cluster. A cluster is where people forge spontaneous conversations. And in a cluster where people with equally intellectually driven minds are openly engaged to discuss with each other, the imagination is unlocked. And universities reap the benefit of the cluster, which is getting back to why I said some of the most inspired I ever felt was on my university campus. That brings us to step 8, build your city. Reed discusses how at the beginning of the 20th century, a French-Swiss architect was the first one to really envision cities as we know them today, with high-rises and cement buildings, very clean and very industrial. And this particular architect had a disdain for the city street. He thought they were dirty, they were disorganized, they were inefficient. He wanted to get rid of them. He wanted to zone all the residential houses in one area and all the business in another. He wanted to use the cheapest building material, which was cement, and he didn't really care about how buildings looked because that didn't matter in their efficiency. And a few decades later, Robert Moses, master planner of New York City, was very keen of these ideas, originated a few decades earlier, and he wanted to impose a master highway system through New York, essentially making city streets obsolete. A bunch of mothers, including a journalist named Jane Jacobs, formed a group together to protest this new change to a city because they saw and recognized the essence of what makes a community a community. They spoke out about the important daily rhythms of daily city life. And they recognized that when a city had certain elements, its innovation was higher. It produced a constant flow of ideas and inventions, ultimately making the city successful. And these are the 4 elements that they pointed out. Number 1, every area must have more than one primary function. You have to have a mixture of residential, business, work, and leisure. People must be going outside at all times of the day to have a steady flow of people. This ensures constant activity even on the weekends and the evenings. Number 2, blocks must be short and walkable. The more foot traffic there is, the more opportunity to encounter new people and new ideas. The more opportunity for connection. Number 3, the buildings must vary in age and condition so that people of different socioeconomic statuses can live, coexist with each other. We're not segregating people by wealth. And number 4, there has to be a sufficiently dense concentration of people. Neighbors should be able to exchange information easily with each other. Neighbors should know each other. And Reed uses this as an example to explain that the imagination echoes the space that it lives in. The imagination doesn't thrive on mile-long stretches of boulevards. And Reed actually argues that the same is true for working in an office. He points out that the most sterile and boring office settings produce the least productivity and innovation, which is why Apple has invested so much into making their headquarters its own little ecosystem. And this got me thinking about why I love my city art studio so much. I love that I have to enter through a coffee shop to get to the elevator. I get to walk through the hustle and bustle of sometimes people in business suits meeting and sometimes artists that look like they're just having coffee for fun. I love coming up the elevator to my 6th floor window where I can look out the window, see the flow of the city, and watch people. Now, these are the 8 steps that I came up with from reading this book, but I highly recommend that you read it as well. And I would love it if you left a comment about which one of these steps you're going to try first, or if you have tried some of these things and how it's affected your creative process and your imagining. So thank you for watching this video, and go chase your dreams.